Okie doke. So once again, just a little reminder to everybody who's joining, please keep your audio on mute and your video off unless you're one of the speakers. And we're looking forward to a wonderful discussion tonight. It's actually now 6 o'clock, so we're going to get started. And I want to open tonight with an acknowledgement that I am here on the lands of the Mawukma-Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area, an unrecognized Indian nation. In Australia and New Zealand, where I come from, every important event is now opened with an acknowledgement of the First Peoples. And while it's by no means a cure for the systemic injustices in our society, it does start the conversation. Tonight, it's our first episode of Society, Robots and Us. We're talking about the conversations that we need to have, and the first topic we address has to be racism. I'm Andra Keay. I'm Managing Director of Silicon Valley Robotics and visiting scholar at Citrus and the Banatao Institute in the People and Robots Lab. This is the week of Juneteenth, the final proclamation of emancipation for American slaves in 1865. And as current events show us, the topic of racism is still incredibly critical. Tonight, we hope to have a conversation that ranges from questions like, can robots be racist, or can they be used to fix racism, to the question of how can we change the systematic racism that infiltrates all aspects of our lives, from industry to academia. Our guest speakers will be sharing their experiences and the actions and outcomes that we can all participate in. We sold out of seats tonight for the discussion, but we'll be trialing a live stream on the Silicon Valley Robotics YouTube, and we'll publish the video recording and transcript later this week on Silicon Valley Robotics and the University of California's Citrus and the Banatao Institute site. And Citrus, of course, stands for Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society. I'd also like to thank the audience tonight for sharing many questions with us ahead of time, both for the speakers and suggestions for future topics. I've analyzed more than 40 suggestions and found these broad themes that you'd like us to discuss further. 10% are looking to explore more applications of robotics for social good. 40% are looking for tips to build better, more usable, more equitable technology while avoiding problems of bias, etc. 10% are asking the big meta questions, like how true are our models? And 20% are asking, how do we fix rogue technology and or rogue companies? It's almost the flip side of the most popular category. And the final 20% are asking more questions about case study and career-based questions. So thank you all for contributing to the discussion already. We're going to have a lot to talk about over the coming weeks. And tonight we'll collect more questions from you via the chat channel. So unless you're a speaker, please leave your video off and your microphone muted. I and Erin Pan, who's helping me tonight, will be relaying questions to the speakers and sharing resources with you in the chat. And finally, I'm honored to introduce each of our guest speakers tonight. We'll be hearing from Chad Jenkins, Monroe Kennedy III, Tom Williams, Jasmine Lawrence, Maynard Holliday, and Ken Goldberg. And first up is Chad Jenkins, who is a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan. He's the leader of the Laboratory for Progress, which means perceptive robots and grounded reasoning systems. And his work and collaborations aim to discover methods for computational reasoning and perception that will enable robots to effectively assist people in common human environments. So over to you, Chad.
All right, thank you so much, Andra. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this is one thing I'm very grateful to the people that are demonstrating, peacefully demonstrating in the streets, because it's bringing new attention to what we know are systemic issues. And I've been in computing for I hate to say it, almost 30 years now. And I've been a roboticist for about 20. And so I get some views on the systemic issues that we're facing. And one thing I'd like to do is build up on some of the recommendations that have been proposed in the blackincomputing.org open letter and call to action. So blackincomputing.org. One of the things that are discussed in that letter is really sort of, you know, many of our systemic issues arise from, you know, the economic engine that was built for the nation, which was rooted in uncompensated slave labor. If we go all the way through the civil rights era, in the 60s and 70s, in the 60s, there was legislation that helped create equal opportunity. In particular, for the STEM disciplines, that existing legislation those existing statutes can really help pretty much bring greater opportunity or more equality to STEM just by upholding them. So in particular, I think we can bring equal opportunity to STEM by upholding Title VI and Title IX. And so if you're not familiar with Title VI, it comes from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And Title IX comes from educational amendments of 1972. And these basically govern institutions that receive federal funding and how they can, in particular universities, and how that's spent. Because the incentives right now in the system that we're seeing for STEM penalize equal opportunity. In particular, like law enforcement, university faculty are just asked to do too much. Given our bandwidth limits, we have to make hard choices about what gets our attention and our effort. And this creates a dilemma about whether we should go and try to bolster ourselves and our personal advancement and ignore the issues of diversity and equal opportunity, or should our role be to create and extend a ladder for others so that we can create opportunity for them and help them go ahead. Because really that's about where you spend your time. If I think about my own personal advancement, it's a lot of that, it's partially the technical and the merit of what I do, the substance of what I do, but it's also a lot about gaining social acceptance within the existing power structures of the people that are privileged enough to enjoy those benefits. And if I can socialize myself with the people that have that privilege, then that gives me the ability to get access to funding, hiring, publishing, citations, all of those things that are part of our peer review and merit review processes. I know that if I take time to help students or others that need opportunity, that I won't be able to have time to do necessarily that socialization. And so I'm faced with this dilemma, because I know if I care about diversity and equal opportunity, I will have to make a professional sacrifice to provide the mentorship and effort needed to broaden participation in our field. It's clear that STEM incentivizes systemic exclusion of underrepresented minorities because the results have been disastrous thus far. All you have to do is look and see at the funding rates of something like the National Science Foundation, and you can see that even though African Americans, Black people represent 13% of the population, I think it would be a miracle if we represented 2% of the funding and 2% of the enrollments and participation in these disciplines. And so I believe that through existing civil rights legislation, and statutes, that we could create a much better society. We saw that yesterday in the upholding of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by the Supreme Court, that basically said you can't discriminate somebody against somebody based on their gender identity or their sexual preference for employment, and that's obviously wrong. But how do we take those statutes and think about the system with respect to all the tech that's essentially going to be responsible for generating the technology and all the advancements that are moving our society and shaping the future? And so I would argue that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that any organization that's receiving federal funding has to make sure that there is not a disparate impact, that you're not affecting one group more than disproportionately disadvantaging one group against another. And so for speaking as somebody who is a descendant of slaves and those who were segregated, I think there is a disparate impact, and I think there's something we can do about it. There are placeholder measures that we can do, such as, you know, there are lots of people that lots of university faculty that work at that take leaves and sabbaticals to work at companies that have not had great representation. I can think of just a few examples like OpenAI or Google DeepMind. Maybe universities shouldn't offer sabbatical and leaves to faculty that are working at those companies, and that's a placeholder measure. But really, at the end, it's about how do you affect the funding that is allowing to us to pick winners and losers? Because at the end of the day, if equal opportunity, that we're striving for, that equal opportunity cannot be true for anybody unless the equal opportunity is true for everybody. Because what's used to stack the deck against one group can be used to stack the deck against any other group. And so that I'll stop there. Thank you, Andra.
You've raised so many really interesting points. I've been on a learning curve around Title VI and Title IX, and just to hear the way you described what their goals are had me thinking that perhaps we should all be being held to account. As you suggested, diversity is, it's going to bite all of us if we don't support diversity across the board. So perhaps part of our hiring questions, our tenure questions, our publication questions should all include what stand are we taking? You know, what work have we done? Not just what stand have we taken, because stands are easy to take, but work is hard to do. So we should all be perhaps liable for the way in which these titles are implemented or not implemented.
Right. I think to me, it just comes down to basic economics. When I wake up in the morning as a faculty member, I have to figure out how do I spend my time such that I can maximize my productivity and my quality of life. And right now, I look at like an endless stream of things that I have to do. If diversity is not incentivized, there's no economic incentive. It doesn't make me more attractive for funding, if it doesn't make me more attractive for publications, more attractive for all of those things that we look at in a hiring, promotions, and tenure process, or any process that would be used by a company, let's say, then it will move down that stack and will never really address it. And so how do we create that incentive? And so if you're a company, you know, it'd be nice to be able to have to make that a priority, but you've got to make money. You have a bottom line. If you're a university, our product is our ideas and people, and we are funded by tuition and public funding, and so I think we should try to represent that public and the future people better by shaping that economic incentive.
That's great. That's a lot to think about there as well. Now, I'm going to ask our next speaker, who also shares an academic background, to perhaps expand a little bit on the topics that Chad has raised. And so I'll be calling next on Monroe Kennedy III, who's an assistant professor in mechanical engineering at Stanford, where he leads the Assistive Robotics and Manipulation Laboratory, called ARM, which is cool, which is working on developing robotic assistants by focusing on combining modeling and control techniques together with machine learning tools. And together, those techniques improve performance for tasks that are highly dynamic, require dexterity, and have considerable complexity and require human-robot collaboration. So Monroe, over to you.
Thank you, Andra. And I should just say, it's quite a pleasure to be here, and also to follow Chad, which I had the pleasure of meeting a while ago. He's one of my heroes in the space. I aspire to be more like him. So I just joined Stanford this past fall, and I've been in academia now for about 10 years, from undergrad to graduate school. And so listening to some of the ideas that Chad raised, thinking about my own experience, and really how this intersects this space of robotics for us and how I can make this relevant. I had a few ideas that came to mind that I think do build on some of Chad's thoughts very well. So really thinking about, my audience here in education, in robotics, I think one of the most important things to do when we want to see change on a large scale is to definitely look inward first. And so I think a huge part is addressing our own biases. And so the first step in becoming more aware or fixing your biases is definitely becoming aware of the biases that you actually have. I'm tempted to make an analogy to machine learning. Those of you who've had a chance to train neural networks know that if you're not careful in the data that you feed your system, right, you can easily have a model that arises that doesn't necessarily reflect the true state of your system or the environment that you're working with. And I think that the analogy between the mechanical brain and the real brain stands to benefit sometimes from these principles. How do we actually think about how we address bias in the way that we think, in the way that we handle information and people around us? Are we cognizant of the fact that we may have actually had skewed data that we need to challenge? How do we force ourselves to address that in ourselves, counter some biases that arise forcefully and intentionally to make our system, the way we behave around people, better? And I think being roboticists, being scientists, being STEM, I think, it's easy to partition our thoughts for robotics and our thoughts for social. But I think there are some tools that we can actually use from both spaces that can really help us be cognizant about how we would address and change some of these in ourselves and even in others. And so I think one discussion that we need to have moving forward is how do we intentionally counter the biases and the stereotypes that we have to make our environments, to make our academic, our professional environments more diverse, better, more welcoming, and remove that ugly strand of racism that exists. So this leads me to, I think, what is the main point of this entire movement that we've been seeing. And it's enough of good words, it's time to take action, right? So how do we actually take the action that will result in a better society from the top down? And I think, this really goes back to what Chad was saying. This is a systemic issue, right? You can say, how many graduate students do I have access to welcome to my lab? You can walk that back and say, well, we need to fix both recruitment and retention, and both of these things need to happen. But, if they're not there in the pool in the first place, we've got to work backward and address those systemic issues, which are not allowing them to be present in the first place, to be in that selection pool, to be the strong candidates, to, make this a more equal society. And so I think we really, as educators and those involved in education, need to look at the entire pipeline, going back to grade and middle school, high school, looking at undergrad, looking at graduate school, and address these issues in the entire pipeline. Because if we address it up the chain, we might, I think, see change later down that pipeline. So I fortunately had the opportunity when I was at the University of Pennsylvania to be involved at multiple levels of this system. And I can tell you, I stepped foot inside of a middle school and I was working with an RET, research experience for teachers. And I'm talking to some of these students, and there's this little African-American boy, and he's so excited about robotics that I'm presenting. And he gives me this idea about some phone that he wants to make, and in this moment, you say as a roboticist, this idea is definitely proposed by a middle schooler, but his passion is so important at that moment that I encourage him. When I say you're thinking on the right track, you're going in the right direction, I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt. And if only I think educators know this, when you look into a child's eyes and you see that moment where you literally could have changed the direction that person might go. We need more people to do that. We need more people to go into schools. We need them to look into these children's faces and tell them, you are a winner. They may not have this support anywhere else, but we have to give it to them. And this can't just be on the shoulders of the middle school and grade school educators that are with him every day. We who do the research in this space, who do the amazing things that we do, we have a profound responsibility to go into these spaces and change the status quo and realize the power that a few words, and more importantly, your time, has when it comes to making a difference at that level. I had the ability to communicate recently with some undergraduates, and we were thinking about, how do we actually improve their experience at the undergraduate level? How do you help them to succeed? One of the things that a lot of Black students feel, and other minorities too, but especially Black, is a need for an increased feeling of belonging, right? Part of this is due to representation, and we need to fix that, as I was saying. And others, part of that can actually come from educators. We as educators have the ability to make those students in our spaces feel more welcomed and affirm that welcoming message. So I encourage educators, I encourage people in this space to think about how you can actually make Black students, and even all students, feel more welcomed in your environment, but especially Black, because there is this lack of feeling of belonging. And then at the graduate level, I think it's really important to have high expectations of your Black and minority students. If you don't give them the opportunity to succeed, if you don't believe in them, then it's hard for them sometimes to pull that out because you're in that mentor role. I know from my own experience, my advisor, Costas Stanilidis and Vijay Kumar, looking at me and saying, "We think you could be a professor," was one of the profound things that said, you know what? I'm going to take that step in that direction. I had self-confidence, but it's different when the person that you respect and is in that leadership roles looks into your eye and sees that special thing as well. And so again, there's a reiterating message here: the role that you play and the position you have, you can speak that change into someone, and it's imperative that you do so, and it will make them feel like they're more belonging. It will increase their self-stock, and help them to achieve. So I'd like to end with two thoughts: some advice for Black students, and some advice for allies. For Black students, there's definitely racism at every level of education. It doesn't matter where you go, everyone has bias, and that bias can come out in different ways and you'll feel it. But what's really hard, I think, is differentiating sometimes the negative input from educators that have this bias or have racism, and the natural struggle that exists within STEM in any degree that you're completing. I had one professor that really highlighted the number of work hours that it takes to become a professional at any trade. And most of those work hours that you do when you're learning a trade are spent in a struggle. You don't get what the material is. You're trying to become better. And often, if you've been told or discouraged in your journey, from as you've been going along, you've been told you weren't smart. If you felt that, right, and then you have this natural struggle that occurs, it's easy for this to compound and add to an imposter syndrome. And we have to be intentional in telling you, look, this is because you're struggling does not mean you don't belong here, right? You're struggling because this is what's turning you into the amazing professional that you will ultimately become if you keep pushing past this. But if you have that negative experience in your past, it's often hard to delineate which is the STEM and which is actually people oppressing you. And both of these are present. And so this is extremely hard. And I don't have all the answers for my Black students, but this is something I hope to pass on, because when this was passed to me, it helped me in moments of struggle when I was going through and I didn't understand material. I didn't have to think, I can't do this because fill in the blank, right? This is part of the struggle. This is part of the journey. And I stand here today and I tell all my students, even though they've been with me for only a year so far, that you need to embrace this struggle, expect the struggle, but realize that the struggle is making you stronger. And I'm patient with you as you're going to compete and complete this process, and become stronger. The second thing for advice for Black students is make sure you build a community of support, right? And it's easier to build that community possibly with those that look like you, but also realize that if we can find allies, you can get that support from wherever it comes, from teachers, from other classmates. Build that community of support. You need to be able to support yourself. Dr. Freeman Habrowski from UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, he tells the story about how he looked in the mirror all the time and said, good morning, Dr. Habrowski. I actually took that in my own playbook. And when things got hard in my own graduate studies, I would look in the mirror and say, good morning, Dr. Kennedy. And I would actually put in my books, property of Dr. Monroe Kennedy III. And my friends would go, you're like 5 years away from your degree. Why are you doing this? It's because it's important to build yourself up, to make yourself ready for that next step. So encourage yourself and make sure you have that community from family, friends of every color, because you need to make it. We need you to make it. Advice for the allies. As I going back to the beginning, I think it's very important that you make Black and other minorities in your sphere feel welcomed. Make them feel that they belong. You may take it for granted because you feel that way. So you say, of course, the conditions are such that you should feel welcome in this beautiful environment, but you don't know their experience. You don't know how they perceive others, how they perceive them, and how others have made them feel and how they perceive them incorrectly. So we need to overcorrect this control feedback loop, right? Let's get some more science in there, and feed them in with that positive feedback so that they feel more welcomed, and you can counter the negative voices that they've been hearing for so long. So be a part of their support structure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monroe. There's a number of amazing messages in there. And, you know, if I listen to your message as well as the message that Chad was saying before, one is that bandwidth is limited. And while you talk about outreach as being critical, it's not going to be possible when you have such a small proportion of people of color in the system. So what I was struck with is that a lot of your mentors who encouraged you were not African American. So that is certainly something that all of us can pick up and take away as an actionable step.
Absolutely.
Well, speaking of that, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Tom Williams, who is not African American, but he is an assistant professor of computer science at the Colorado School of Mines, where he directs the Mines Interactive Robotics Research Lab. And his research focuses on enabling and understanding natural language-based human-robot interaction that's sensitive to environmental, cognitive, social, and moral contexts. And Tom is also one of the co-authors of a letter that has just been sent around to the human-robot interaction community called No Justice, No Robots. And there is, I will ask you to explain a little bit more about that, Tom.
Sure, absolutely. So first off, thank you so much for having me to not only share, but also learn from everybody else. So before I talk about the letter, which I know is sort of why you asked me to be here, I wanted to talk very briefly about my research because I swear it's important. So in our lab, we study human-robot communication, how humans and robots talk to each other. And one of my main research areas in that area is moral communication. So if you tell a robot to do something it shouldn't do, how can it determine, one, not to do it, and two, how to respond? And one of our driving motivations is that both of these pieces are critical. It isn't enough just to refuse to do bad things. When the robot is told to do something inappropriate or when it observes something immoral, it needs to make clear to its human teammates that it's unwilling to comply and why. Our research shows that robots have a lot of potential for real moral influence over human teammates. So to prevent the team's moral principles from being weakened, a robot has to be forceful and clear about calling out observed or proposed actions that would violate those principles. So the key distinction here, not just refusing to actively cause harm, but also using social and moral influence to steer community values. So of course, the same thing is true for us as roboticists. We have to not just refuse to build robots that actively cause harm, which seems obvious, but we also need to make sure that our words and actions as roboticists actively promote the moral principles that we believe are important in our community. So some of my colleagues and I in Colorado created this online petition, No Justice, No Robots, where we basically said, we refuse to build robots for or in collaboration with the police. When we wrote the petition, we were mainly thinking of it from this first perspective, refusing to actively cause harm. We looked out our windows at the cops in riot gear who were tear gassing our city, and we said, you know, I'm not sure this is really who we want to be trusting our robots with. But if you're only trying to avoid actively causing direct harm with your technology, it's really easy to find excuses in corner cases. And this came up a lot in the discussions after we released the letter. It's easy to say, well, the specific cops I'm planning to work with aren't going to attack people. Or it might be easy to say, I'm developing a social robot that, based off of its use case, could not ever be used to hurt people. And both of those things could be true. But I would also argue that we should be refusing to build even benign or socially beneficial robots in collaboration with or for the use of police because of what that action would communicate to our community about our moral principles. So in an article in Robotics and Automation magazine last year, Brettel, Rigetti, and Madhavan talk about the risks of where we as roboticists get our money and who we collaborate with. They use an example, as an example, MIT's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. They point out that while the research that MIT performed with Epstein's money may have been for noble purposes, the collaboration was obviously deeply problematic because, well, before Epstein's child sex trafficking was widely exposed, he used his philanthropy in collaboration with MIT to launder his own reputation and legitimacy. And after he was widely exposed, it caused a scandal for MIT because the collaboration implied that some folks at MIT must have to some extent condoned this behavior. Otherwise, why would they have associated themselves with him? And so similarly, if we choose to build robots for or with the police, regardless of how socially beneficial those robots might be, this action does two things. First, it launders the reputation of the institution of policing. And two, it condones the existence and behavior of that institution, which is deeply problematic. Just as Chad mentioned that the economic sort of foundations of the country were rooted in slavery, the origins of the police force in America were also rooted in enacting violence and enslaving people of color. And to a large extent, that's what they continue to do in society today through police brutality that we've been observing very recently and mass incarceration in general. And I don't think that these are things we want to condone as roboticists. And so I think that the conversations we've had around the letter have been really productive for me for helping me sort of expand my own understanding, but beyond these sort of like local things I was observing and taking a more system-oriented perspective. Finally, I just want to comment on, so Monroe, when he was talking about the importance of getting people in the pipeline, I think that, you know, as he said, it's really important not just to be going out and working with children to help get them into the pipeline, but also to be thinking sort of like upwards in addition to downwards, and trying to get more people into faculty positions in order to help get more people into the pipeline. And I'll just share one brief anecdote. In my own lab, I have tried to recruit students of color and have made offers to students of color, but they have not chosen to come and work with me. And I think part of this is, well, when I look at at where they went as opposed to, you know, at mines, we do not have any Black or Latino members on our faculty. And you know, you could ask, why would a student want to come there? Why would they think they would feel accepted there when there aren't people who look like them on the faculty? And this year was very disappointing to me. This year, so as an example of a concrete action that we can take in academia, but also elsewhere, I don't really know how business works, get involved with the process of hiring. So this year I volunteered to lead our hiring committee in our department, and made sure that the people we brought to campus and interviewed weren't just, you know, basically people that looked like me, but instead that we had women and people of color and Latinos and LGBT faculty, and maybe even more importantly, people who were at the intersection of multiple of those categories. Of course, I say it was a disappointing year because, of course, like most people, we weren't able to hire because COVID. Hopefully we'll have better luck next year. Finally, one other thing that we can do as roboticists is, well, promote the voices of roboticists who aren't straight white men like me. So with that, I'm going to stop talking so other people can talk.
Well, Tom, I have to admire you for stepping up into a discussion where you're effectively going to be the straw man for white male privilege. Mm-hmm. And so it does take courage to do that. And indeed for all of us to confess our shortcomings and to say, well, we may have meant well and we may have tried, but to actually look at the metrics to say, well, what was the impact of that? I tend to experience this a lot from the position of being a woman in robotics. And one of the questions that companies come to me all the time with is, well, we'd like to hire women, but we can't find them. And, you know, what do we need to do? And there is endless literature on the relationship between the pipeline and the pond, and having to fix the toxic pond before you should expect people in the pipeline to swim in it, shall we say. And yet at the same time, we're starting from a very poor ratio indeed, and we're going to have to, you know, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps to improve these figures. And it's very interesting when you compare success across disciplines. So for example, the computer science field and engineering was one of the earliest successes of women moving into academia, and then it stalled. And what we've seen since then is a steady increase of the number of women in almost every academic science, except for the computer science.
Except computing, yep.
Engineering side. So we know that, you know, women are going to university more. And the question then becomes is, why are they not going to these particular disciplines, and what can be done about it? I have found in my readings around gender that it's far, far more than one solution. It's multiple efforts to address problems systematically across the entire pipeline. And then, of course, this comes back to Chad's point right at the very start. What is the financial incentive here? Are we incentivizing good behavior? And if we're not, then it is going to be a very, very difficult struggle indeed.
I want to just add one
Yes?
final thing, building on what you just said about it not just being one solution. So in the chat, there were a couple questions in the questions that you got from the audience before. There were two questions. One is, how can we use robots to solve racism? And the other was robots and automation, will they cause more joblessness for people of color? And so I think for both of those, it's really critical to think beyond just one solution. In terms of how can we use robots to solve racism, I don't think you want to be using robots as the only way that you are trying to address racism. Instead, we need to be, if we really want to reduce racism in robotics and elsewhere, we need to be engaging with other aspects of society and politics in order that are better suited towards solving some of those problems. And then similarly, are robots and automation going to cause more joblessness for people of color? Yes. And again, that's not the solution to that might not be within robotics. It might be, and likely is, investigating other economic structures that can help solve that problem. So if we want to address some of these problems that are happening within robotics, we need to look beyond only using robots as the hammer we know how to use in order to solve those problems.
Andrew, if you don't mind, I don't want to.
Please do, Chad.
But I just want to say on that point, if you want to know the thing that keeps me up at night the most is that we will not use robots to help to create more jobs, to address critical issues that we have in education, our infrastructure, agriculture, space exploration. We're going to use this technology to essentially make it cheaper to do the things that we're doing and use less human labor. I would make the argument that since the passage of the Civil Rights legislation in 1964, but more importantly, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which came out the same year as Moore's Law, that what you've seen is both an exponential increase in our computational power, as given by Dennard scaling and Moore's Law, but also you've seen an exponential increase in incarceration, because as we've automated, we've had less use for people. Those people don't get jobs. They have to resort to other ways to earn a living. and that builds up the massive incarceration system. And Michelle Alexander goes through this in the new Jim Crow, but I think I'm worried about the future Jim Crow, which is I worry what we're building using AI technology and large scale computing.
That's an excellent point, Chad. We're going to definitely have, as a topic, deeper looks into the economic impact and the labor impact of robotics, because there's a lot of very scary figures out there that when you look more closely are not quite what they seem. But this is a really serious topic and we need to spend time on it. What I would like to do right now is introduce our next speaker, Jasmine Lawrence, as we segue more into industry. And Jasmine's technical program manager on the blood donations team at Facebook, and was previously technical program manager at SoftBank Robotics America, where she led a multidisciplinary team to create software for social humanoid robots. But one of the things that I find most appealing is that at the age of 13, after attending an NFTE biz camp, Jasmine founded Eden Bodyworks to meet her own need for affordable natural hair and body care products. And after almost 14 years in business, her products are available at Target, Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, Amazon, Kroger, H-E-B, Sally Beauty Supply stores, everywhere. And over to you, Jasmine.
Hi. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. I just started a new role recently as a product manager working on the Everyday Robots project at X, the Moonshot Factory. It's a crazy place and an interesting way to think about solving problems at scale in the long term. But I want to actually talk about the robotics work. I come from a very, I'll just say, interesting perspective. There's a lot of intersectionality happening with me as a person, as a Black woman in tech, living in the US, once a researcher, once a developer, now more of a product person, as an entrepreneur, and also as someone who has a background at working at, giant companies, building very simple things, very complex things. So I have some thoughts. I have some, perspectives to share. I appreciate you, Andra, for making this space for us to honestly just be able to be vocal and share our thoughts and perspectives. I'll try not to say too much because honestly, I do feel like the value of this is the discussion with the people who chose to be a part of this conversation, as well as the action that follows up from this. So I hope that my words are useful for the career-focused people, the product-centered people, and are just thought-provoking suggestions for me to throw out there. I don't have a law for you or some things to just say, do this or don't do that. I just have things for you to think about as a person who's also trying to build things. So let's just dive in. Let's get started. I will say I didn't learn a lot of this in school, which is probably, if I can say this to the three folks in academia, I definitely had a course on, robots and ethics, but a lot of this stuff about really using my job to make a difference in the world was not something that was reinforced to me from my professors. So if I could make a request from the academia side of this conversation, it would be to elevate these conversations and, to bring up some of the questions that I'll be bringing up during the part of my discussion. I unfortunately had to learn a lot of these things by making mistakes on the job and watching technology hurt people and watching technology help people to realize what are the practices that are going to stick as I manage new products and what things do I need to let go and truly change my thinking on. So the first key thing I want to bring up was that anything that we create is based on a set of priorities, literally just the projects that we choose, the things that get funded, the companies that get started, it's based on a set of priorities. And I know that a lot of us, including myself, we chose our role, we chose our career, we chose the thing that we spend most of our time doing because of that vague human notion of, I want to make the world a better place to live in. And I just want to encourage everyone that there are a lot of opportunities to increase your impact in that perspective of making the world a better place by going beyond like first world problems of what I'm going to call making things more productive. I feel like this is a very, very common theme in a lot of things that are being invested in today, a lot of companies that are being built, a lot of technology even in making us more productive. And I think we just previously just chatted really briefly on just the impact of the force and who, when we make things more productive, who's actually getting the bad end of that deal. But speaking of first world, I'll say that there are actually a lot of opportunity here in the US to elevate people out of poverty, to save lives, to increase equity. And when we think about these types of problems, we think about third world countries, we think about Africa, we think about the severely poor, when truly in our backyards, there are these, we don't recognize, like there are these huge communities that are in these situations that feel like they're only happening in the third world. There are a lot of people who see their life as like having enough to eat, having a place to sleep, having a family or parents that care about them as everyone's experience. And I just would just challenge that and say it's not. It really is not. And there's so much that we can do just by choosing how we spend our time to influence that. Speaking of like how we spend our time and how we spend our money, a coworker of mine actually shared with me a poem called Whitey on the Moon. It's by Jill Scott Heron. I definitely encourage you to look into it. It's a reflection of our investments in space exploration versus our investments in our local communities. And it just raises a question for me of when we're talking about priorities and the priorities of what gets invested in, be it time or finances, to answer the question, like, do we truly value the equity of all people over technological progress and financial gain? I can say no. I can just say no right now. We really don't. But I can also say that I don't think there's a reason why those things have to be mutually exclusive and why we can't find ways to marry them. I think we just have to be creative. If we're going to try and make change in a very capitalist society, we have to find a way for those things to be joined, or we have to find some way for people to reject, the reward systems of our current society to truly go ahead and value these other things. So another way to think about it is like, what are the problems that our best people are trying to solve, right? Are they selling products? Are they selling ads? Are they trying to make things faster? Or are they truly trying to solve problems that fundamentally elevate people, that fight for equity, that make life better for everyone? So that's just one category of thinking. What are the priorities behind the work that we do? What are the priorities behind where our money and our time goes? This is something I think that you can take and apply to your own life, but also go ask your managers and the leaders of your organizations, what are our priorities? Why do we think this problem matters? What is the total addressable market for this? And who are we leaving out and who are we not helping and supporting by, making, one feature or one product a priority? The second area I wanted to bring up was that everything that we build is imbued with our own values and our own biases, right? So I know we talked about who's in the pipeline, who are we bringing to the table, who's a part of these conversations, whether it's diverse or not, whether it's all, white men or all Black men or all white women or whatever mix it is, we're all going to come with these perspectives. We're all going to come with these biases and just these values. And so, for those two things that I feel like are going to be embedded in whatever we build, for our values, we need to be transparent about what they are and not sugarcoat them and not hide them. If your value is making a ton of money at whatever expense, then just say it. Don't try and mask it in we give 1% of our revenue to whatever charity. Just say that you love making the 99% and you're happy to give 1% of away if it means you get to keep the 99%. Like, I've seen a lot of companies, I've seen like Netflix and Facebook, and a lot of people say like, these are our values for our people. These are the guiding principles they use to make decisions. And I'd love to see more transparency and the values, not just of the orgs, but the people running them and the people in them, because I think a lot of people in larger organizations would love to do very, very different things with the money and with the resources that a lot of companies have, that if they just ask, what do you value? Do your personal values align with the place that you work? And I think more people would say no than they care to realize, because that's not necessarily something you feel like you can expect or feel like you can challenge when you work at a company. You feel like you go there, you bring your skills, and they give you money for them. But I would say as an individual working, you know, in industry, you have a lot more sway and should be a lot more concerned. I think, Tom, like you were saying about, you know, MIT choosing who they collaborate with, you get to choose who you collaborate with, who you donate, who you give your skills to, and how that furthers or elevates the values. And then last thing regarding values is when we are transparent about them, we should be open to feedback. We should be open to hearing both the positive praise of, yes, I love that your, you know, value is this, or the negative criticism, if only to use it for our own introspection and development. I'm not saying you have to change your values. I'm not asking people to transform who they are. I just want people to be able to have conversations and recognize that at the root of what we prioritize, at the root of a lot of our decisions, it exposes and it reveals our values, whether or not we want to write them out or put them in words. So I definitely, that's a thought exercise there. In terms of biases, there's so much out there on unconscious bias right now. So I'm not even going to be, you know, go deep on that topic, but they have to be discovered and they have to be acknowledged before they can be mitigated. That is just like a huge, like, of all the people who have reached out to me and said, are you okay? And what can I do to help you? I just want people to learn, like, what do you think is true about the world? What do you think is true in your relation to other people? How is that influencing how you behave? It's very hard, you know, it's very hard to recognize that. And, you know, even myself, I've recognized some biases against other people. You know, I told again a story at work of how, you know, everyone's working at home. And I went down in the middle of the workday to check my mail, and I'm wearing my black tech hoodie and my black, you know, sweats and my black mask, and I had a black hair wrap on, and I went down to go check my mail, and I saw like an elderly white woman who was also down there checking her mail, you know, very, you know, covered in all this protective gear. And I was walking down the stairs and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna wait till she leaves, because I'm sure she's gonna give me some stink eye. She's gonna be, you know, mad that I exist or whatever. And I just recognized, like, wow, I'm projecting my own fears, my own concerns about how I'm gonna be judged, about how society perceives me on what could be a super sweet woman. And then, you know, there's all these tactics of, okay, how can I replace how I projected onto that woman with the positive stereotypes? How many elderly white women have been my mentors in school, or have been the mothers of my friends who would let me spend the night over holidays, or made food for me, or cared for me? Like, how can I replace that stigma? You know, I'm not immune to it just because I'm a Black woman, right? Like, I'm not bias free or discrimination free or judgment free. So I would say acknowledge them, discover them, challenge yourself, and recognize like where you have those areas of growth. And the last thing about just putting our values and biases and things is, I think there's a lot of new work coming up about a theme that I'll call responsible innovation. And it just requires us as product people to do a lot more learning and consideration of not just the benefits of the things that we build, but the harms that they can cause before we build them, right? Like, it's really easy to have an innovation and go, wow, this is gonna change the lives of so many people. This is gonna improve the lives of so many people. And I think it's much harder to put that on the shelf for 5 minutes and say, okay, what is the worst thing that could happen? What is the worst headline that could be written? Who are the people who are gonna it's just gonna be horrible for them? And trying to think of ways to either modify your product or invest in other organizations or areas or people to try and balance that out, that other side, so that you're working for net good and not just assuming that the benefit is just enough to carry the weight or to cover up the shame of the bad stuff you might bring into the world. That is a new way of thinking. That's a completely new way of thinking. There's like when you listen to those medicine commercials where they tell you nice and slowly, it's going to cure this, it's going to help that. And then they zip through all of those side effects, and it might cause this and it might cause that and it might cause that. But you won't have that first issue that, you thought was so bad. We need to slow down. We need to look deeper into those things and figure out how we can also mitigate those negative harms. The last thing I wanted to cover was, just because we're talking about robots, just like one super obvious one that is specifically related to robots, which are that there are still hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of unsolved ethical questions. And more of them are created as robots become more and more capable. People ask the questions, are they tools or are they slaves? Are they replacing humans or are they complementing the abilities of humans? Like, all of that, I'll just say, as a product person, is just framing, but we really are gonna need to answer those questions. And sometimes it's going to take pausing some projects and slowing down and having conversations and thinking about the first order, second order, third order effects of what we're creating, and how that will truly impact our society. As people, we have changed the surface of the world to be what we want it to be. We have pushed out animals. We have destroyed plants. We're killing our planet so that we can be okay, right? Introducing robots, introducing technology is only going to accelerate all of the bad things that we're doing, that we have acknowledged, like, we need to address. It's only going to just make it harder for us to take a step back and go back and undo some of those things. So tons of problems. And then lastly, like, what role, as the creators, what role are we going to take in ensuring that positive impact, that net positive impact? I will say, I will make a pledge that I'm open to being held accountable for the good and the bad of the things that I built. I want to be called out. I want to be yelled at. I want to be challenged. I want to be, encouraged to use renewable energy, or I want to, hear from, people who are allies and advocates for communities that my personal work might be negatively affecting. I will admit that I have blind spots and I'm not seeing all of that. And I'd love to see that from every builder, every inventor, every creator, every student, just that ownership of, I might hurt someone. I know I didn't try. I'm not being intentional, but it just might happen. So there's a lot of soul searching, and there's a lot of actions that we can truly take. So takeaways: change your job, spend your time working on problems that might not affect you directly. Change how you spend your money. Change how you do philanthropy. Participate in our political system and advocate for something that literally doesn't benefit you, but that benefits your neighbor or some other person. There's so much we can do. It's more than we can discuss in this hour. But thank you for this platform.
Absolutely, and you're coming back, I hope, in the future to talk about things like sustainability in robotics, inclusivity in design, the role of design ahead of production. There are so many other nuances happening here, and I love your optimism as well, because this is the Anthropocene era. We have changed the face of the world, and it reflects the values that we have. So we have to stop, recognize what our values are, and then go and make those changes. And I have been encouraged to see that happening, people holding large firms accountable and just allowing themselves to take power. And but we have another fantastic speaker. We'll go a little bit over for sure, because this discussion is just too rich. Now I'd like to introduce Maynard Holliday, who is currently at the senior engineer at the RAND Corporation, previously worked for Barack Obama at the Pentagon, where he launched the Defense Innovation Unit. He was project manager for Pioneer, a robot which helped to map the inside of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And Maynard also co-founded Robot Garden Makerspace with me back in 2012. But as well as that, he's been working with the Bay Area Public Schools, lecturing on robotics, teaching robotics through the Citizen Schools program in East Oakland, and was recognized with a Presidential Volunteer Service Award from the White House for his efforts with Citizen Schools. Over to you, Maynard.
My pleasure. Thanks, Andra. And I want to echo what Chad and Jasmine said earlier about being involved. And so when I was in the Obama administration, one of their priorities was, STEM diversity. And I led the Department of Defense effort on that, and their strategy entailed involving people like ourselves who are on this call with the media in Hollywood and script writers and showrunners to have them see us so that they could write about us in their shows. And I'm old enough to be, an original Trekkie. And, one of the reasons I became an engineer is because of the reflection I saw in fiction, because there were no, African-American scientists, there was no Neil deGrasse Tyson, that generation. That was Carl Sagan. And so those media portrayals are so important. And so I encourage, my colleagues here on the call and on the panel to reach out to the Science and Entertainment Exchange to become, part of that, so that, you can also, lend your voice. And so I'm going to tick off some things that, being at the intersection of government and industry that, we are, advocating for, and, what you're seeing the private sector now also doing. So you have, Goldman Sachs in New York saying they're not going to take any companies public that don't have women on their boards. California, same thing. So bottom line, diversify your boards. Boards should hold themselves and management accountable for specific objectives around recruitment and retention of underrepresented minorities and women. Executive compensation should be tied to diversity and inclusion metrics. Partner with Black-owned companies to be a vendor or supplier. I sit on my undergrad institution's ME advisory board, and we got them to agree to look at further outreach of their suppliers. And then something that innovative is going on here in Silicon Valley, find a way to partner with HBCUs. And so Google has actually an HBCU campus in Mountain View with about 4 or 5 HBCUs resident on the Mountain View campus with their computer science professors, as well as a cohort of students that are doing projects along with Google researchers. And so if Google can do it, a lot of other companies can do it. And, you talk about pipeline, that's a source for potential students, for your PhD programs. And then as Chad said up front about and then, Professor Kennedy talked about evaluating your machine learning models to ensure, there's no bias. So there's no substitute for having diversity at the table to run those models and to ground truth them, against, diversity metrics. So I just sat in on a call that was sponsored by Black and AI, talking about, the problems with facial recognition. And I can't pronounce the researcher's last name, but she's at the MIT Media Lab. And, she was studying facial recognition because she wanted to do a mirror that recognized faces. And she used all these algorithms from top, Google and other places. And when she went to use them, they couldn't recognize her Black face. And big problem. And so you need diversity at the table. And so lastly, I'm going to speak on, kind of an algorithmic Bill of Rights that, can be translated, to things around, robotics. So transparency, you have the right to know when an algorithm is being used to make a decision about you. You have the right to explanation. You have a right to be given explanations on how the algorithms affect you. You should have the right to consent. You have the right to give or refuse or consent for any AI application that has a material impact. When I was in the Pentagon, DARPA looked at, high stakes and what we call tool AI, and said, these high stakes AI, you have to, have transparency and accountability, and adding to that, freedom from bias. You have the right to evidence showing that the algorithms have been tested for bias related to race, gender, and other protected characteristics. A feedback mechanism. You need the right to exert some degree of control over how the algorithms work. Portability, you have the right to easily transfer, all your data from one provider to another. Redress, you have the right to, if you believe an algorithmic system has unfairly penalized you, you need to be able to, get in a feedback loop, understand that. Algorithmic literacy, you have the right to free educational resources to learn about these systems, and independent oversight. You have the right to expect that an independent oversight body will be appointed to conduct retrospective analyses. So I'm going to stop there. I know we're over, and I welcome everybody's feedback, and happy to be a resource. And my battery's going low, so I'm going to turn my camera off and plug in, and I'll be on audio.
Oh, thank you so much, Maynard. And that is an excellent list. I really thank you for sharing that. I'm a connoisseur of the different ethics approaches to robotics and AI. And I know we had some great questions around these subjects as well. We're going to continue these discussions where we'll get a chance to dive into some of the things we didn't. Our final speaker, I've got to give Ken a quick introduction. Ken Goldberg is an artist, inventor, and roboticist. He is the William S. Floyd Jr. Distinguished Chair in Engineering at UC Berkeley and Chief Scientist at Ambidextrous Robotics. Also on the editorial board of the journal Science Robotics, and chair of the Industrial Engineering and Operations Research Department, and co-founded the IEEE Transactions on Automation Science and Engineering. Also one of the co-founders of AFRON. I'm going to come up with new facts every single time I introduce you, Ken. I swear, there's such richness, but over to you for concluding remarks.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to these panelists, and I am very inspired by all the comments that were made tonight. I think that that COVID-19 has had a humbling experience for all of us, to the degree that we didn't see it coming, and it's an opportunity for self-reflection. And what's come out, this eruption of this wave of reaction to the police brutality is, I believe this could be an inflection point, and I hope it is. I think what Jasmine said about action is so important, that how can we sustain this moment and have it be something that will continue ongoing. So I'm here to listen. I was taking notes. I grew up in a family that was very supportive of civil rights. My parents went to Africa and Nigeria when I was born there in the 60s. And but I've been really reflecting on my own white privilege and my blindness, my biases. I want to say that I'm guilty. I'm trying to really understand and reflect on this. And so I think that on behalf of so many of the good ideas that came here from Chad and Monroe, Maynard, and Jasmine and Tom, I think that we can really draw on these and start to really think carefully about what we can all do. And one question I have for the group, and I know we're out of time, but one question I have is, I know that we have Black in AI, and it's been mentioned several times. And Redi Adebebe is a friend, and she's coming to Berkeley next year. We're very excited about that. But I'm wondering, is there a similar organization for robotics, a Black in robotics organization? Does that exist yet? And if not, would that be something to be worth starting?
So let me take that. And by the way, Ken, thank you very much. And I appreciate all the great words that you've said. And I think this really is helping us take what's happening and turn it from feelings and emotion to action. which can address those systemic issues. Black in AI, however, we don't have anything like that in robotics right now. But we should note that Black in AI doesn't really kind of represent AI. It represents more of the social science side of machine learning. And so, so I think what you'll find is that there are lots of communities that could come together to represent a larger perspective. There is no one monolithic Black community. And so, so I think there are things that can develop in that regard, but it's still going to take time to provide a unified voice. I would say that a lot of Black people in engineering, robotics, AI still have trouble coming up and speaking the truth from their perspective. I think a lot of people still feel like there will be a penalty, that you'll be labeled as angry or incivil or worse. I've heard other worse terminology come up. I'm glad that Reddit's her generation has a platform to speak more clearly. But for those of us who came up through who have roots in slavery and segregation, there's still a hesitancy, and that requires a good partnership, good partners from people who represent the overrepresented majorities, as well as creating environments. Monroe said this: feeling isolated. If you don't feel isolated, you feel like you're supported, then I think we can start to have more organizations such as the Black in Robotics that could come together. I would direct you to the Black in Computing. We can do something like that. So there's blackincomputing.org, and there I think you're starting to see that community even come together after decades of being out there.
I want to add some color to just that hesitancy as well, in terms of essentially having the burden being put on you to solve these problems. I'm just starting a new role. I want to step up and support my organization's effort to, overcome injustice in the world, but I just don't want to. I know that it will be work in addition to the full-time job they already pay me to do. I know that it's not like the role that they hired me to do. I understand that they respect and value my voice, but I do have personal fears that I'm going to be seen as the social justice warrior on the team, or the person who's spending all their time doing all these like Black D&I, events, rather than being seen as a strong, confident, inclusive thinking product manager who understands like that this should be a priority. So to have someone, like you said, that it's in a majority group, make this a priority, carve out the time, add this to our, perf metrics and things like that, make it a desirable thing to work on, whether you're Black or not. That's kind of the adjustment that I would love to see before I step up and go, okay, if this is going to be recognized as something that's important, I'll do it. If not, if it's just they're making space for me to solve problems or for us to congregate as minorities, I don't see the progress there. And I do feel the fear of alienating my coworkers, or seeming like I have any idea how to fix this, or that I have everything going on. It's tough. I feel like it happens to women. It happens to Black people. It happens to queer folks. It just allyship.
I hear you, Jasmine. And so let me ask you a question: what could I do? I mean, could I help? Could I do some of this legwork? Would that be a way to contribute? I mean, I'm trying to find a way that, because I think one of the things that's so helpful about Black in AI is that there's a critical mass, just the things that we've talked about here, and then there's a list of people. So when I get invited to give a lecture, I would like to be able to pass that on and say, go here, look, there's a lot of great other speakers in robotics that would be fantastic for your organization, right? I want to have that critical group. So how can I support that?
Yeah, that's very hard. And it always makes me feel very awkward that there's going to be some list of Black people you can choose from, because there's always going to be someone who should be on that list who's not on that list. And just thinking about it from the flip side, like, where do you get your go-to list of non-Black people? They're just stars in their field. They just have recognition. They're elevated. They're getting exposure. So what are the things that are causing maybe those Black voices or minority voices to be pushed down, to not be considered? What are the criteria or rankings or papers or whatever, and how can they reach out and find more people themselves in a diverse set of communities, right? Like someone mentioned, going to the HBCUs, like meeting people where they are versus expecting them to show up at, at ICRA or wherever, those conversations are happening. Like putting that effort, like you said, doing that legwork to go find those people. I mean, it's just hard, and then it's hard to go, okay, do we have someone from Asia on this panel? Do we have a woman on this panel? Do we have a, whatever on this panel? It's just so hard to play that diversity whack-a-mole rather than figuring out, is there equity in these spaces, in these rooms, in these decision-making, and in getting this exposure. So it's as easy as finding a white person to be there.
Just to add to that, I want to put two things on that. One, if there is something you can do, Ken, and I think it's something that everybody could do, which is provide mentorship and good teaching for students. Isolation is a critical problem, not just in for in academia, but also in industry. I have a colleague at Howard who said this thing that broke my heart. Even though Howard has this relationship with Google, I think if you actually ask HBUs what they think about Google, it would not. I don't think it's actually favorable, to be honest. But he would say that they have this relationship with Google. They graduate their students. Their students are excited to take on these six-figure salaries, and a lot of them are first generation, so they feel like this is how they're going to be able to create a living. But the environment for them is so bad that many of them are not just gone from Google, but gone from computing within 2 to 3 years. And I think it's if people understand that they should reach out and engage, and what somebody looks like that can be a good contributor may not look like what they're expecting to see. And so I think with that, it's it is the isolation, but it is going out. I don't think we can. I was kind of troubled by the way that we treat HBCUs. That they don't necessarily, if you look at their faculty don't look like very Black these days, right? I think if you talk to the HBCU faculty, if you had somebody like you could have somebody on this panel, they'll tell you that the situation is pretty dire right now, financially and in terms of being pushed out. And so it's much more complicated. But to me, what the protests are saying in the street is, please listen. If you listen to what people have to say, listen to Black people, right? And keep an open mind. And I think that can go a long way.
Thank you so much, Chad. I've heard so much tonight that has been a great inspiration for many talks to come. And what I'm hoping is that hopefully without making you do extra work, we can open this platform for your voices. We have so much more that we need to still address. And whether that's, in fact, I was just really overwhelmed by the sheer scope of the problems that we covered in the discussion today. And if it takes us an hour, 15 minutes, just to outline the size of the problem, it's surely going to take us more than an hour to address any solutions. So we just need to continue this conversation and to continue doing some of the work behind it. And the message that I really strongly got was that we need to mentor and we need to break down the isolation around people of color in the robotics and computing communities. And I think we can all harness our own empathy for feeling isolated, for feeling like we don't belong, and just share our feelings in someone else's position and go out of our way a little bit more, put more work in, make diversity metrics part of everybody's job. That is probably the single biggest thing that we can start to do as well, whatever stage of a company we happen to be at. Again, thank you all so much for tonight. I'm really looking forward to continuing the discussion, and we'll say good night.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Andra.
Thank you. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.